Hello everyone and welcome to the School of Taste. Welcome back this time to our third session in this series, A Taste of Europe. Last time out we were in France looking at various fascinating regional French reds. This time we're going to drop south of the Pyrenees and go and have a look at what is going on in Spanish reds. So I think another fascinating session coming up. If you are watching live, as ever, please use the questions function for your comments or questions. And if you are watching on recording, thank you for taking the time to do that. So, Spanish reds. I deliberately did not include Rioja in this session. It wasn't some kind of weird omission on my part, but I think that is probably the Spanish red with which we are most familiar. So I thought it might be more interesting to look at ones which perhaps don't quite have the profile, perhaps don't get exported in the same quantities. Perhaps we need to learn a little bit more about them. So I don't think anything that we're going to be tasting today is obscure or totally unusual, but I think that somehow Rioja almost becomes a synonym for Spanish red wine. And I think there's a lot more going on in the country than just that. So that's the reason why I'm not mentioning Rioja today, not because I've got anything against the wonderful wines of that region. Okay, so without further ado, what can we expect in general from Spanish reds? As always, I like to think in very big picture terms, general terms, about any stylistic continuities that we can see in wines from one particular country. Now, again, you know, just like trying to say that all French reds have got something in common, saying that all Spanish reds, all the way up from the Atlantic Northwest to the Mediterranean Southeast, is quite a big and quite a bold statement. So we move forward with a degree of humility about what we can really assert. But nonetheless, I think there are a few general things that we can point out. The first being the most obvious, which is that between last session and this session, we've just dropped a little bit further south. So in general, you're not here any longer in places like the Loire Valley or even Bordeaux in difficult vintages where it's really a struggle to get the wines ripe. One vintage out of 10, like perhaps 2013, may be difficult in parts of northern Spain, but that really is the exception. Ripeness is not usually too much of a difficulty in Spain, particularly on the Mediterranean side. Where we're going to start in the northwest corner of Spain, perhaps a little bit cooler, but in general, ripeness is not such a challenge as it might be in parts of France or other parts of Northern Europe. On the contrary, you can actually have the opposite problem, which we'll talk about in the context of a couple of the wines of the regions today, which is how do you maintain freshness. You know, overall these, I mean, I feel like, you know, every session we are dealing with the spectre of climate change. That, you know, we're dealing with some warm to hot climate regions today, the Mediterranean regions, and you sort of think, look, every textbook that's been written about these regions has always called them warm to hot climates, and now we're here in 2020, and my goodness, those regions are not getting any cooler. So, you know, the challenge for the next generation is going to be how to work with this climate. You know, people of my generation, the kind of millennial generation just taking over from their parents, perhaps they're the ones investing in different viticulture in the vineyard and really confronting as the challenge of their professional careers during the next 30 years, managing their wineries. How can my wines continue to exist and continue to be of a similar profile to what my parents made in the next 30 years until, say, the middle of the 21st century? It's a big challenge. Tempranillo clearly is probably the most synonymous variety with red wines from Spain. But Garnacha, there's a whole sea of Garnacha out there in Spain. Easy, fruity, juicy wine at the bottom level. And at the top level, as I hope we're going to see with one of the wines a bit later, very serious wines. But, you know, a Mediterranean variety ripening well in a broadly Mediterranean climate, certainly on the east side of the country, making ripe, sometimes sweet tasting fruit. Usually Spanish reds, I think we're thinking about a blend. We didn't talk about this too much in the context of the French wines last time, but we're going to be seeing something similar to what we saw with the southwest and southern French wines of last time, which is that you can have a majority of one variety, but usually there's something else in there as well. We're not in Italy here, where this focus on varietal purity plays such a big part of the profile of Italian red wines. Traditional Spanish reliance on winemaking as being an integral part of the style of the wines, common in Rioja, of course. But I think I sort of get the impression that across the country, as in so many other countries, frankly, but perhaps especially in Spain, because they did use so much oak, we are beginning to see signs of the reining off of this a little bit more, to try and capture a bit more of the personality of the variety in the place. I'll mention this now, but we can also talk about it in the context of Garnacha when we're talking about Priorat later. The one region that I'm not going to discuss today, because I still think is a very tiny region that's only just beginning to put itself on the map, but the Grados Mountains for Garnacha, you know, sort of celebrated among those in the know of Spanish wine as being the most, you know, really one of the most exciting places now in Spain. Just a handful of producers working with very old Garnacha on a variety of soil types, often at altitude in the mountains above Madrid. And what's the style of these wines that is getting everyone so excited? Well, basically, it's Garnacha in Pinot Noir mode. No ostensible new oak, absolute translucency of color, of aroma, and of flavor, total purity. So I only mention that just to make the point that, you know, when people get excited about Spanish wine in the future going forward, these are going to be exciting regions to watch. It just so happens that one of them is all about the emphasis of the purity of expression of variety in place. So I think that's quite telling. Okay, so why don't we pour our first wine, if you have it, which is the Bierzo Mentilla. I hope that you guys managed to find that without too much difficulty. Probably if you know, we're working with that wine style 20 years ago, it might have been more tricky, but 2 or 3 producers have really put the region on the map and are producing very good, consistent wines in what is fantastic for people like us in good quantities. People like Raul Perez, Palacios, people like that. So those wines are becoming increasingly available. Let's just take a look at our map. So while you're pouring your wines, just for you to have something to think about, let's do what we did last time. If you have a style sentence, a summary, you want to sum up the wine, please do share it using the questions function. So talk about whether the wine's aromatic, the body weight of the wine, any of interesting or unexpected flavor profiles, texture of the fruit, the tannins, the quality of the finish, the length. Please do share. I'd be very interested to hear your impressions on your wines. And if you can just mention the name of the wine as well, it just gives me some context. But while you guys are doing that, just amazingly far northwest Spain here. So you can see that we are, you know, right above the narrow stretch of Portugal on the Portuguese, above the Portuguese border there. So really in the far northwest corner, you know, we know that Vinho Verde is really right around here on the coast, below Santiago de Compostela. So just, you know, somewhat inland from there. In terms of this map, let's just situate ourselves. If you look at my cursor, Ribera del Duero is here, much more inland. So you can imagine the difference of an inland climate there, and Logroño is Rioja. So a bit closer to the sea, of course, but also much further east, over towards, you know, getting closer now to the Mediterranean coast than the Atlantic coast. Okay, so I'm going to wait for you guys to give me the answers. You're going to tell me what I'm going to say about Mencía. I know that you guys are great tasters. Tufi, welcome Tufi. 2012, 14.5%. I would say that's quite a lot of alcohol for this variety, but let's see what you got. Medium red, black fruit, less ripe than elsewhere in Spain. Ditto my comments about climate, northwestern origin. Sour cherry, herbs, spice, fresh acidity. Sounds delicious. Moderate chalky tannins on the cheeks, medium body, medium length with a savory, dry finish. So actually quite a lot going on in that description. It seems like mostly medium everything, but with quite interesting complex aromas and flavors, herbs, spices, that kind of thing. Sounds good. Nupa, Bodegas Losada, floral with black and blue fruits. Spicy with vibrant acidity and firm, dusty tannins. Good. So both Nupa and Tufi mentioning spice, both mentioning acidity, and both mentioning tannins. You might, naturally suppose that being a bit further north, perhaps we're in a slightly lighter register. But I think Tufi was saying medium body and medium tannins, and it seems like Nupa is somewhere in the same world. I think you can get light examples of this place, of this variety, but I think in general, a medium body, is more normal. Again, recently we've had some, very warm vintages, and certainly that, gives more body. My own example is 2017, which frankly is a bit of a torrid vintage, very warm. 2017, there was frost. You lose a lot of volume in the bunches. The grapes that are left remaining on the vines, there's only a much reduced number of them. And then there was a very hot growing season in 2017. So what gets remained is very, very concentrated. So it can be quite sweet, powerful wines from 2017. I don't think typical, honestly. I think 2017 is a bit tough, but 2018 is lovely if that's what you're buying off the shelf. Michelle saying ripe red fruit with moderate chalky tannins. Herbaceous, a slightly green character. So that could be what the other people are calling spice. There's something certainly a little funky, a little savory perhaps to go along with the red fruit, and notable lively acidity, Michelle says. Good. Sarah, pretty aromatic, ripe strawberry, sour red cherry, black olive, interesting note, kind of unexpected in there amid those red fruits, 13.5%. Tannins on the lower side, with acidity providing the structure, fruit a bit sour. Good. So again, this combination of red fruits, but also some kind of savory element to that. Yeah, I love it. I think these are great descriptions, and they make me want to drink the wines that you're tasting. So that is certainly the name of the game when it comes to describing wine. Okay, here are just a few thoughts. Nothing here you don't already know. So starting from the third point, a moderate climate giving moderate kind of wines. This is sort of a native way that I think about these things. Can be warm, but you're still relatively close to the Atlantic. A bit similar perhaps to the Loire Valley, just a lot further south. So medium-bodied fresh wines, the acidity, as all you guys have mentioned, is a consistent feature across the wines. Aromatically funky, especially with age. So funky, I guess what I'm referring to in younger wines is the kind of notes that some people have been saying: black olive, herbal, spice. The point I'm making is these are not simply just fruit wines. There's another kind of element going on in there, which I think is the real flavor, interest, and complexity of the variety, which I love. These are, I don't know how much you paid for your wines, but usually the going rate for sort of entry level is, $20, €20, something like that. So maybe a little bit more than, say, Crianza Rioja, which might be 15, or Garnacha, I don't know where from, Monsanto or something, which might be 15 or 12. So a touch more, but not that much more. But I think, you're getting an interesting additional degree of flavor complexity from that savory note that you guys are all talking about. But with age, if any of you have ever aged Bierzo, like Tufi has, those notes really come to predominate. The black olive or the spice, and the gaminess of the wine really comes out as well. It becomes really quite a savory, wild kind of tasting, smelling wine with age, which I think is really attractive. As long as you're okay with that. I mean, I wouldn't give it to someone who is not familiar with wine. But yeah, very, very interesting with age. Texture. I think one of the great joys about this variety is the texture of the wine. Just a few of you commented on, the crisp acidity and the chalky or the dusty tannins. But what I find really cool is that in spite of those sort of dry elements to the wine, the texture of the fruit is quite plush and rich. Not in the sense of being heavy or cloying, but just velvety and soft. And I think that's just such an interesting combination to go along with the acidity and the tannins. I love that style. And I know that, people like Raul Perez and people like that are making very ambitious styles, $40, $50, $60, things like that. And those might have a bit more tannin, a bit more savoriness perhaps. But I think at this, I'm calling it entry level, maybe it's a little over entry level, but in this kind of $20 price category, I think you're getting a lot of really interesting texture to go along with the other elements of the wine and flavor complexity. I think those two things put together, the flavor complexity and the texture, kind of set this variety apart at this price point. Perhaps the most interesting part of this discussion, though, is about what you might think it was. What did you guys think when you smelled it or when you tasted it? It tastes like anything else? Any of the varieties I've listed here or any others that I haven't listed? I think one of the reasons why this is such a pertinent question is that wine lovers are still just familiarizing themselves with this variety, so they don't, the sort of confusions category doesn't come ready-made. I think we're just discovering what this variety is, so we're only just discovering what else we might confuse it with. Michelle commenting that Cab Franc, because of the kind of herbal aroma, which I totally get, and Sarah saying the cool climate Syrah because of the spice note. Yeah, totally. So let's just go through those two. So the Cabernet Franc, because of that slightly herbal note, I certainly distinguish, by the way, between herbaceous and herbal. So I think the Bordeaux varieties are herbaceous often, and certainly I include Sauvignon Blanc in there. If you've ever tasted Sauvignon Gris, that's even more so, perhaps too much so, which is why you don't see it very often. But I'm saying that the Bordeaux variety is herbaceous. But that to me is different from herbal, which is like Italian reds. If you think about a Sangiovese or something like that, they've got a herbal twang to them. But that's different because that's a herbal register. You can get all sorts of, things like rosemary and sage and all those kind of characters in that herbal category, but that's different from the herbaceous category, which is a bit aggressive greenness. And so, Michelle, the only thing I would say is I would more put these herbal aromas in herbal rather than herbaceous. But a lot of other things about Cab Franc are right as well. Some nice red fruit, some nice texture of the fruit, and quite high acidity and moderate, sometimes chalky tannins as well. So that all checks out. Certainly, I would look out for the tannins, not so much on the gums as you would find in Cabernet Franc as a typical Bordeaux variety, but more in the cheeks, and having more of a chalky, sandy sensation. I know that in cool climates like the Loire Valley, the Cabernet Franc can have a sort of chalky texture to the tannins as well, of course, but more squarely on the gums. And I think generally, just because we're further south, a bit of additional ripeness in the Cabernet Franc here. A more interesting confusion, I think, in that category would be with Saint-Emilion or other right bank Bordeaux being a blend of Merlot and Cab Franc. So the Merlot would give the generosity of texture and the red fruit, and the Cabernet Franc might give the herbal funkiness of the aromatics. Look out for, again, the location of the tannins being different in the cheeks, and also perhaps just an additional slightly sun-kissed ripeness. Just a very effortless texture of the wine. Perhaps the tannins aren't quite so upright and square as you get in the Bordeaux varieties, making them, this English term, four-square tannins, four-square meaning quite rigid and kind of predictable, upstanding, kind of Bordeaux tannins, and a bit more perhaps generosity, a bit more relaxed style here in Spain. Syrah, yes, so Syrah again because of the herbal notes, black olive, like you said, the lively acidity. We're talking about cooler climate examples, maybe in New Zealand, but probably we're going to be still in the old world because of the overall sense of European dry earthiness. So something like a Croze, or even one of the outlying appellations of the Northern Rhone, like Colline Rodanienne, things like that. So 12.5% alcohol, medium body, fresh, aromatic style. Certainly you get the texture as well in Syrah, don't you? That's the interesting thing. But it's the location of the tannins, which is such a key point of difference, because they're in exactly the opposite place. Syrah on the tongue, and here really around the edge of the mouth. I think in the cheeks, but also a little bit on the gums, but just compared to the location on the tongue of Syrah. Tufi says, the funkiness reminds me of Mourvèdre. Interesting, because of the savory, animally, sauvage character, but the structure makes one think of Cabernet Franc. The structure makes one think of Cabernet Franc exactly because of the slightly chalky tannins, and the tannins are like Tempranillos because they've got the same chalky texture. So that's why I did include Tempranillo in this list here, because the tannins felt in the cheeks and on the gums is more similar to Tempranillo, and also the texture, the chalky texture is very, very similar. But I think that you get more mid-palate richness of fruit and velvety texture than you do in Tempranillo, apart from in the more stylized modern versions, which are more likely to see oak. I don't think that, certainly at this level of wine, you're not going to get too much new oak. Certainly at higher levels, yes, but I do think most of these people that we've mentioned, Palacios and Raul Perez and people like this, are big exponents of expressing the variety. So I think that in this moderate climate, you're not going to see a lot of new oak here. So hopefully that shouldn't mess you up too much. Any final comments on Mencia, Bierzo? As you can tell, I love the variety. I think it's just a gorgeous little interesting complex variety that for a very small price is one of those wines that you can store for 10 years and it will just be so aromatically complex and interesting when the time comes to open the bottle. And I think it's such a sort of recipe, or not a recipe, but a benchmark for what what could be a bright light in a warming climate, in a cool northwestern Spanish location like this, to be able to make fresh wines. You all mentioned the acidity as being conspicuous in the wines, and that's what we're going to need going forward. Okay, so I'd love to spend more time on Bierzo, but I do want to compare it to other Spanish reds. So why don't we go ahead and pour the next wine, which is going to be Ribera del Duero. Fine as well if you've got Rioja with the same variety, but I will just focus my sort of geographical remarks on Ribera today. So do the same thing if you don't mind. If you feel like writing a sentence for me, then please, I would be very happy if you would. About the overall style of the wine. It's always good, I think, to be on a second wine, so you've got something over and against to compare it with. So if you want to compare it to Mencia, that's great. If you want to take it on its own terms, that's totally fine as well. So as I mentioned in the map on the previous slide, much more inland Ribera del Duero. Above you can see, Madrid, which is sort of the geographical center point of the country. We're just a couple of hours north of Madrid and a couple of hours southwest of Rioja in Logroño. but I don't know how many of you have been to Ribera, but it's a pretty desolate part of Spain. I mean, really, almost kind of windswept. You feel the altitude that you're at, and there's just nothing there. It's just on the road to nowhere. It's just very old Spain. You know, it's just all, you know, the great medieval stories about Spain and knights and castles and all this stuff that you associate with that whole world. It feels like it should be here, right around this area. And so it seems like a kind of miracle that someone figured out that this was a good place to grow vines, but it surely is. So, you know, pretty close to the middle of the country, and as a result, more of a continental climate, hotter climate. So any first impressions about what you're tasting? So once again, we're in the Tempranillo variety, also grown further west in Toro. Now, don't quote me because I don't know exactly where it is on this map, but it's like somewhere towards the Portuguese border, somewhere here. If someone knows better, then please tell me. Tinto de Toro, Tempranillo around there as well. So all across this middle band of Spain, from Toro to up to Logroño to the foothills of the Pyrenees up here, is Tempranillo land. And then, of course, we know so much of southern Spain is as well. Below Madrid, also, it's a variety that grows quite easily in so many different climates. But you really, I hope, will see the difference in the style of the one you just had with the style of the Ribera. Very different climate should result in a very different style of wine. Natively, we know that Tempranillo can produce a similar profile of wine to Mencía in terms of body weight, in terms of retaining the acidity, in terms of moderate alcohol and red fruited character. It's all possible to make those styles from the variety, but in this place, that would be unusual, I think. So I'm just interested to see your comments. Okay, Michelle, super ripe, but not overripe. Blackberries, but still quite savory. Elevated alcohol, firm, grippy tannins, refreshing acidity, new oak with vanilla, clove notes. Michelle, do you think that's American or French oak? I know they use both in the region. The most famous producer in the region, as you know, is Vega Sicilia, you know, Spain's first growth, and their aging regime of their reds is almost notoriously complicated. And I don't know whether it follows a recipe or whether it's just different every year, but they use a whole variety of different size oak, different origins, and as well as concrete and all sorts of other stuff. And then after long aging, the wines are finally bottled. But yeah, Michelle's description sounds right to me. So black fruited with notable alcohol, tannins, and oak influence. Michelle saying it could be a combination of French and American oak. Okay, so let me see what I came up with. So I still think, I think we've been talking about Ribera del Duero since about the mid-90s, certainly by the early 2000s. It was quite well known, not just because of Vega Sicilia, like I mentioned, but because of Pesquera, I guess, was really a winery that put the region on the map, but also a bunch of people invested to make a bigger style of wine, like Pingus, Numancia, now owned by Hennessy. Nupa saying riper, sweeter red fruit with vanilla notes. So again, an oak note for Nupa with full cheek coating tannins. There we go. We've heard of mouth coating tannins, but you guys have been tasting with me too long. And so you know I love the cheeks, and Nupa is saying cheek coating tannins. I love that description. Tufi, as if on cue, has got a Tinto de Toro, which is great. That now, Toro, for those of you who haven't had it, is a much more similar style to Ribera than it is to Rioja, a powerful style. Dark red, high intensity of very ripe black fruit, some red fruit too, earth, high levels of chalky cheek tannins, moderate acidity, full body with a medium length and a dry finish with some torrefaction notes. Great note, Tufi. Torrefaction being a kind of roasted quality to the fruit on the end that you occasionally get in Spanish reds, but it sounds very similar, doesn't it, to Ribera, that example from Toro. Emil saying lots of black fruit, damson as well. Damson, that's a great note for anyone who knows what damson is. Dry figs and tomatoes, carob and dates, so some kind of warm spices, almost dried fruit. Bit unbalanced there because of alcohol, 14.5%. Good. Tannins felt on the cheeks and the front of the gums. Good. Sarah, Crianza, 2014. So yeah, by the way, it's a good point. A lot of Ribera del Duero doesn't use the Crianza Reserva, Gran Reserva system, but many still do. So kind of interesting to see them when they're around. Vanilla, coffee, sweet black cherry perfume, dry but sweet. Yeah, kind of interesting combo, dry but sweet. Pretty medium body, but 14.5%. So again, emphasis on the alcohol. But still, as Sarah says, as so many of you have said, good acidity. And yeah, I think, you know, the second bullet point here is the key, of course, to the acidity. Two you know, factors go into that. The high altitude. It's like a plane, you know, it's like a plateau. You're up high on these limestone soils, and the diurnal variation. It's like a pop quiz question. We know that many wine regions suffer frost risk at the beginning of the growing season, but name one that risks frost at the end of the growing season. It's Ribera del Duero. So because you're so high up, very cold at date at either end, at night at either end of the growing season. But even during the heat of the summer, you know, 35 degrees C during the day, but I don't know what down to 10 at night, something like that. So concentrated, powerful wines, I think that goes without saying. Combine freshness with deep fruit, good acidity and a refreshing finish. So I really do want to emphasize the acidity. I think it's such a key aspect of the style because it almost is unexpected. In Rioja, you expect it with a medium body, medium alcohol, medium acidity, but here with the concentration and the depth of fruit, you may expect the acidity to be a bit more inconspicuous. Like sometimes in Bordeaux, I feel like that. Maybe in left bank Bordeaux, of course the acidity is there, but you don't really think about it. But here you actually do think about it, perhaps because it's kind of unexpected. The chalky tannins in the cheeks that so many of you commented on, I think that's just such a hallmark of the style, of the variety of the place, and also one very, very perhaps indispensable point that takes you away from so many other international style wines that this could be. I think, you know, I was talking at the top about the way that overall in Spain, I think we're moving much towards, you know, a more restrained profile, more expressive of variety and place rather than of winemaking. And I was talking about oak in that context, but I would add to that extraction. I mean, everywhere in the wine world suffered from a period of excess extraction density, oak and alcohol between about 1997 and 2010. But a particularly bad place was Spain. And if there's one really bad region for it, it was Ribera del Duero. Don't tell anyone I said this, but I mean, I had this tasting of the Numancia, Termantia wines owned by Moet Hennessy from that region earlier this year before COVID. And the wines were undrinkable. They're just big alcoholic soupy messes. I haven't tasted the more recent vintages since 2010, but I would bet they would be so much more attractive and drinkable. I mean, yes, some of you have commented on alcohol and things like that, but it doesn't sound like any of you are like, oh, these wines are just too much and they're too heavy and cloying with the weight of the fruit. That's what they used to be like. But I think the perfect combination in Ribera is to have a deep fruit, but somehow enlivened and enlightened by the bright acidity. I think that's a great combination. Before, if those wines were naturally going to compete with, say, you know, Napa Valley, Super Tuscans, big Australians, things like that, more powerful styles of Bordeaux. You know, those wines that across the world feature so heavily on the wine lists of steakhouses, things like that. I think we're now, you know, happily moving back to an era where, yes, they're still powerful, and that's the place speaking, but you at least can taste the variety and the full purity of the variety so nicely now. So I love that. Any thoughts about confusions? Did you think it tasted like any of those that I just mentioned? Modern Rioja, I mentioned, of course, is a very obvious confusion. Modern Rioja being those producers that tend to, I guess, do three things. Extract a bit more, so you don't ever get that slightly thin fruit concentration of the really super traditional style Rioja producers, but they're really, instead, the fruit is very, it's very concentrated. There's an emphasis on texture in those producers, very, very velvety, seamless fruit. And finally, use of French rather than American oak in those more modernist producers, barriques, things like that. Roda, those kind of wines, R-O-D-A, if you know those wines. Very velvety, plush wines where you have to search a little bit for what the variety is. So that would be my most obvious confusion. But as I said, if you were doing this tasting 10 years ago, you'd have, I think, a whole bunch of other possibilities. Toro, yeah, absolutely. I'm not even going to go and try and define the difference between Toro and Ribera. I'm not even going to go there. They're just very, very similar wines. Perhaps a bit more brightness of acidity in Ribera, but honestly, don't sweat that. I think you're going to go play the numbers and go with Ribera del Duero as being the bigger region, more producers, more exports. Sonny's saying, who are the good producers from modern Rioja you'd recommend? Well, I would do someone who splits the difference a little bit, like a Muga. Those kind of wines, they're absolutely identifiable. Tempranillo, identifiable Rioja, but they're very well made. They've got a very seamless texture, very harmonious integration of the oak and all those different elements. I like those wines. The Tufi's asking a question, Rioja, even modern, does it use more Garnacha and Graziano than Ribera or Toro? Yeah, that's a great point, Tufi. Thank you. That's a great remark. So Tufi making the point that here in Ribera land, Ribera and definitely Toro, where Tempranillo is usually 100% in Toro, or at least often is, and the same in Ribera, famously not so much in Vega Sicilia, but most of the other producers were at or very close to 100% Tempranillo. But Tufi making a great point that there's more blending varieties in Rioja. Remember what I said at the top about Spain, generally speaking, being a blending country, unlike Italy. And Rioja is the wine I was thinking of when I was saying that. Yeah, absolutely. Nupa saying, is Toro more rustic? I think that's just a producer thing. I mean, I had the most elegant spelt Toro from the Vega Sicilia stable. What's the wine called? Pintia. You can't tell me that Pintia is rustic. So I think it's just producer. Toro has bigger tannins, maybe. The Ribera has pretty big tannins to me. Honestly, don't sweat that confusion too much between those two regions. Very similar style. Okay, but I have to say overall, look, you know me, I'm a kind of, you know, cool climate kind of person. I love, you know, Pinot and Syrah and Mencia and things like that. But tasting these wines recently, I really have enjoyed them much more than I thought. I think because of the combination of the acidity and the chalky tannins make the wines drier and fresher and so much more drinkable to me. And I really enjoy that. So I am enthusiastic about the region, Ribera. Okay, let us move on to another big wine, this time from a different variety. So if you have a wine from Priorat, or maybe you have one from neighboring Montsant, then please pour it now. Or any other origin for Garnacha in Spain. Same thing, please tell me your thoughts. What leaps out the glass at you. So let us, I think, probably the location of Priorat is more familiar to us than a couple of the others, but As a reminder, so you can see Logroño in the top left, so that's Rioja. And then we're now into Catalonia, so a very different part of Spain, away from the heartland. And now we're certainly in the Mediterranean territory and back with a Mediterranean variety. Garnacha, we talked about this in the context of Bandol, we were talking about last time. I remember we talked about what it means for Bandol to be a Mediterranean wine. And we were not talking about it so much in the context of Garnacha, because it's not really a Garnacha wine, but we were talking about it in the combination of ripeness from the sunny southern origin. We're, really in southern Europe now, but also in the ability for that wine, the Bandol wine, to maintain some kind of savory or wild or herbal or gamey or meaty savory quality. And that combination of ripeness with some kind of dry component we talked about as being particularly Mediterranean. So interesting to see whether we think the same thing is true here in Priorat. So just about an hour away from Barcelona. It looks, if you've never been there, it looks like it's super close to the coast and it will have a sort of coastal climate. But when I went there, it doesn't feel like it's close to the coast, and it doesn't feel like you're getting any kind of influence from the Mediterranean. It just feels hot and, again, a bit desolate. It's a pretty wild landscape. These hills, often quite steep, famously, slate, the Licorella, all this. It just seems to reflect the heat, the sunlight, can feel very, very hot in the summer. But yeah, please tell me your impressions. So yes, we are in Garnacha territory, but not usually 100% Garnacha. So a bit similar to other famous Garnacha Grenache wines, Chateauneuf du Pape, other southern Rhone villages. The producers, I believe, in Priorat do see an advantage to blending varieties. I did a tasting for a corporate group on Friday, and someone asked me a question, the subtext of the question being, but aren't single variety, monovarietal wines better than blends? Which I think is a sort of common assumption. If you like kind of purity of expression, if you like Burgundy or something. But it's very obvious to me that in places like Priorat, in places like Bordeaux, Southern Rhone, what you're getting from a blend is so much more than you can get from a single variety. So you might want to think about that as you're tasting your wine as well. If you do know the blend, or if the blend is unusual in your wine, then please say. But usually I'm working on the assumption that Priorat is, 75% Garnacha, and then maybe some other stuff as well. Okay, excuse me, Michelle. Super ripe, fresh black fruit with dried fruit, fig, dates, quite floral. So, just listen to the things that Michelle's mentioned. Black fruit, dried fruit, and floral notes all going on at once. So sounds like some nice flavor complexity there. Concentrated fruit, moderate chalky tannins on the gums with refreshing acidity. Yeah, it's great to have a note on the acidity when you're talking about Garnacha, isn't it? Because that is not always an assumption with this style of wine, with this variety from this kind of climate, but also a good reason why you might want to include other varieties, of which your friend, I think, especially in Priorat, is the Carignan, Mazuelo, acidity, which the Garnacha can lack. So a very important component. Other things that variety can give, well, a couple of, I think, very important things. Tannin and color. Often we talk about how pale colored Garnacha is. So winemakers love to make slightly deeper colored wines. I don't know why. I guess they think that's what the market wants, but they do. So Carignan's always good for that. But so acidity is obvious in the context of Garnacha, why you might want some of that, but tannin as well. Tannin, I think you want always to add to a Garnacha blend in the role that Syrah plays in Côte du Rhône or Mourvèdre perhaps in further south, Châteauneuf-du-Pape, of providing a bit of not only structure, so the wine doesn't feel as if it's falling apart on the palate, like it's just a big, heavy gob of sweet, ripe fruit, but so the structure it gives, the architecture of the wine has got some kind of structure, but also the sense of dryness that structure gives as a counterbalance to the fruit. So I think what's fascinating is in the previous two wines, we've just seen exactly what I just described about, structure is useful, but the dry quality that comes from the tannins can be such a good counterbalance to the ripe fruit. Ribera del Duero, the chalky quality of the tannins, and also a similar sensation in Mencía, actually. Not quite as ripe fruit, so you don't need as much tannin to balance it, of course, and nor would you expect to get that much from that region, but still the chalkiness can be very useful. Tufi. In Montsant, neighboring region, Montsant, by the way, for those of you who don't know, it can be a great source of value, very similar style of wines to Priorat, but everything just dialed down a bit, perhaps not so much alcohol, body, tannin, everything, but really for a small price. Tufi, medium red, high intensity of very ripe fruit, spice, stony minerality. Yes, great to have a note on minerality. High levels of fine-grained, a bit loose-knit tannins all over the mouth with some focus on the gums. Fresh acidity, good. Full body, medium length with a dry, warm finish. Yeah, so emphasis here on the full body, acidity, powerful tannins, but also of a kind of stony minerality, as Tufi describes it. And once again, I love the stony note, not just because it adds a degree of flavor, aromatic complexity to the wine, but also, again, it contributes to the sense of dryness, the sense that we have a wine which isn't just pure fruit, which I guess in this kind of variety, in this kind of place, is always the risk. So you're piling up these different elements that contribute to the balance of the wine. Good. Nupa, deep color with fresh and dried fruit. So again, Nupa, repeating what Michelle said, that you've both got, ripe, juicy fruits, but also some dried fruits. Fresh acidity, savory, chalky tannins, surprisingly high alcohol, 15.6%. And that's just what it says on the label. But well integrated. So to have 15.6% well integrated means that you have to have a pretty huge body, a density of fruit to be able to absorb that alcohol in a way that doesn't seem to stick out too much. Good. Okay, let's see what I was thinking. Just posing the question there about whether this is Spain's biggest wine by kind of body. We might have that conversation about the final wine in today's session as well, but judging by what Nupa was saying, full body, very high alcohol, certainly a contender. So then the question for the winemaker is, how are you going to manage that? Do you embrace that, or do you try and manage it? So yeah, the concentrated fruit, powerful tannins. So again, you don't expect the tannin so much from the Garnacha, but I don't think it comes so much from the Garnacha. I think it comes from the Carignan mostly. High alcohol. Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I've written down here the confusion, with Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but I don't really know that it. Do you think it's a confusion with Châteauneuf-du-Pape? To me, the style is quite different, and we'll talk about those confusions. Yeah, I mean, I get the point, that these are Grenache wines with a full body and high alcohol, but they have quite a different flavor profile, I think. Yeah, so Garnacha being Garnacha, wherever it's grown, whether it's in Châteauneuf-du-Pape or here, is still Garnacha, and that means that the risk of oxidation is always there. I don't know. Someone asked me in another one of these sessions, what is it about Garnacha that makes it prone to oxidation? If you leave a bottle open overnight, I feel like it's more likely not to be fresh the next day than, say, a Bordeaux variety would be, or a Mencia would be, or a Tempranillo. And I guess I have a few ideas, but I don't know. I mean, I think it's generally Garnacha, a high pH variety. Without the added Carignan, it can be a bit soft, and that certainly doesn't help. Not that much tannin without the Carignan, so again, that would be something that would maintain freshness. Not that much acidity, but here you would think the Carignan would be able to manage all those things. But in any case, you do occasionally risk a combination of two things in Priorat that you should always look out for if you think you might be in Priorat land, which is overripeness. Overripeness to me is when you move beyond black and blue fruits and into dried fruits. If a wine is raisiny, dates, prunes, things like that, to me, that's not good news. I don't think you want that in a wine, in a table wine ever. I don't think that's what a winemaker is looking for. So that's one issue, overripeness, and some of you have mentioned those kind of notes. And then oxidation, perhaps if you've got more of a Garnacha blend, tastes delightful at the beginning, but perhaps it falls apart in the glass and just oxidizes. If it's not already got dried fruits, it might become so. But for instance, my wine from Palacios is just very pure and spicy and slaty and minerally and really delightful and complex and fresh. So certainly I think that we're going in that direction, which is great, which I think is great news. Finish. You guys tell me, do you think your wine finishes dry or finishes on the sweet fruit that characterizes Garnacha usually? Is there a dry finish which then would add to this list of components that would balance out the ripe fruit, i.e. the acidity, the dry tannins, and any sense of minerality? Can we add to that a dry finish? Or do we think, like I was saying last time, I think one of the very few exceptions to French wine finishing dry is, Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Are we going to say that as well about Priorat, that this is a wine with a sweeter finish? Or maybe the Carignan wins out in the end. Let me just taste mine, actually. Let me check on that very question in this one. My one, actually, you get ripe fruit, but it's still dry on the finish, which I think is a nice combination. Michelle's saying slight confection on the finish. So yeah, so we are getting closer to the territory of not finishing dry for a European wine, which again, I think it would be, as a rule, atypical. But I think we're going to give the benefit of the doubt to Priorat and say that it just stays on the right side of dry and sweet. So for that reason, I think the powerful tannins, the very structured quality of the wine, takes it a little bit away from Châteauneuf-du-Pape. I think he tastes the additional ripeness. Chateauneuf, I think, paradoxically, though, would have a slightly sweeter kirsch-like finish. I mean, in the old days of Priorat, again, 10 plus years ago, just massive, dense, concentrated wine in just the same way I was talking about with Ribera del Duero a few minutes ago. But I think today, the number of confusions are much more reduced because you can see that it's still European wine. And then if you're in European wine, then you're thinking Southern Europe, ripe but dry, which is what I always think about, especially in the Spain area, Spain, Portugal, Iberian Peninsula area, maybe doesn't have the obvious acidity to be an Italian variety. So if you know it's not Châteauneuf-du-Pape, then you're really in Spain. And then you're in, it's not Ribera del Duero, it doesn't have the correct structure or texture of the tannins. So then I might think possibly about Douro being like a table Douro red. But I would think more powerful structure all around. I mean, really mouth coating tannins, and a very dry heart to Douro reds, just drier than Garnacha wines tend to be. So I think in more modern, up-to-date expressions of this region of Priorat, then hopefully we're reducing the number of confusions, which is what we want to do, because that means we're expressing the variety in the place, which, as I always say, is the name of the game. Tufi saying, Collioure, Maori Sec, Côte de Roussillon, yeah, same kind of blends of varieties just around the corner of the Mediterranean, at the very southern tip of France there. I mean, possibly, but I guess my question would be, would those wines ever have the ambition, the structure, the age-worthiness of a Priorat? If you want to say, on the other hand, oh, I'm thinking more about Monsant, then possibly those ones, yeah. Yeah, I could see that. But I think that Priorat is such an ambitious wine in terms of the density and of being, you know, even at the entry level, which is not nothing, it's $30, isn't it, for entry level Priorat these days? But these are still, you know, 15, 20-year wines. And so that's a pretty serious benchmark that you're setting there. And so overall concentration, depth of fruit, intensity of flavor, and age-worthiness are things I think would really separate. Okay, so yeah, another wine that, you know, I wouldn't necessarily always expect to enjoy, but actually I really do like my example. Just really much fresher and drier than I would have thought, and I think that's a great direction for Priorat to go in, if it can. Okay, so final wine. We are going to move down the Mediterranean coast and taste our wine, which is built on the Monastrell variety, Mourvèdre. So please pour that now if you have it. Now, I didn't say, Catherine, let me just ask Catherine's question. Commando G Garnacha, is this the style that is Pinot like Grenache? Yes. Commando G is one of these wines from up here on this map in the Grados Mountains. The new style of very pure Pinot Noir like Grenache. Yeah, probably the most famous exponent of that style, which is just becoming popular now. Anyway, so you can see down here, actually, where this marker is Yecla, and Jumilla is just a little bit further down around here, I think. So inland from the Mediterranean, but much further south and east, you can see where we were. Well, actually, you can't even, I chopped it off, but we were up here just a minute ago in Catalonia, so a lot further south. So really, I mean, in terms of European wines, you are getting pretty far south now. You're comparing it to, you know, the bottom third of Italy and Sicily. Greece, I mean, you know, Athens and below, but there's not many red wines on the islands, really. They're more white wines. And the southern part of Portugal, of course, way below the Douro now. So we're talking about Lisbon and further south. So the point I'm making is there's just not that many European red wine regions which are this far south. So just the context for the tasting is just to consider what a southern European wine this is that we're about to taste. So please give me your note if you managed to find an example of Jumilla or Yecla. Hopefully one that did not strain the bank balance too much, generally not expensive wines. I actually did want to find, you know, like a good example, a sort of an example that showed the variety in the place, but so I was going to spend $20, $25. I couldn't even find one, actually. I think mine was like $13 or $14. So I know they're out there, but perhaps, you know, the region is more associated with more inexpensive wines, certainly than Priorat, where we just were, or Rioja or Ribera. So Monastrell, Mourvèdre in France. We had some discussion of this variety when we were talking about Bandol. Maybe some of you managed to preserve your glass of Bandol from last time. But if you think about what makes Mourvèdre as a variety, what to expect, a ripe variety which needs warm conditions, warm Mediterranean climate. But what is great about it by contrast to say Garnacha, is that in that kind of climate, it can still retain some kind of savory component. So that comes in part from the flavors and the aromas, which, as we were mentioning before, are kind of wild and gamey and funky. And, you know, Tufi was saying that in some ways the Mencia flavors and aromas have got something about them that, of Mourvedre, the kind of gamey, meaty, earthy quality, olive, tapenade, those kind of things. So partly the dry quality of Mourvedre comes from that, but also significantly in Mourvedre from the tannins. Very, very big tannins usually in Mourvedre. You know, these powerful tannins felt on the gums can also contribute to this sense of dryness, just like we were talking about in the context of Priorat. Michelle saying super peppery, spicy, black olive, savory, ripe black fruit, fresh acidity, moderate fine-grained tannins, and not a lot of mid-palate fruit. Interesting. So, Michelle, is your point that where is the focal point of the wine? Is it on the tannins, or is it more about the aromatics of the wine? What about the finish? Does the fruit re-emerge on the finish? But it seems from what Michelle's saying, an aromatic style, no shortage of flavor, as you might expect from this kind of warm climate. You know, another thing to think about perhaps when you're tasting this wine is about clarity and precision of flavor. Remember when we talk about the Mencia, or even the Ribera del Duero, we're talking about freshness and acidity and how you get a lot of different flavors. But none of you said this, but I kind of feel that sometimes in those kind of wines, the brightness of the acidity means that you can taste each flavor almost individually, which I think is really nice. I think it's much more difficult to do that in a hot region. But you know, perhaps if you had a good example of Bandol last time, or you've got a good example here, or you had a good example of Priorat, then nonetheless you're able to do that. So I think that if you can do that in a warm, hot climate, then that's a great thing. And that would be an example of where this new style Garnacha that we were talking about near Madrid is being very successful. Yeah, Michelle saying you do get fruit on the finish, it just seems a bit hollow in the middle. Okay, interesting. Tufi from Yecla, 15% alcohol. Yeah, I mean, that would be typical, I think, to hit 15%, not unusual at all. Deep red, high intensity of very ripe, almost raisiny black fruit. Almost raisiny, yeah. So think about what I was saying there earlier on about the dried fruits in the context of Priorat. So again, they're re-emerging here. Hints of funkiness, moderate acidity, high level of somewhat rustic tannins felt on the gums, full body, a bit viscous. So viscous in this context, I believe means that you know, the fruit is so ripe, there's almost a bit of thickness to it, you know, a viscosity to the texture of the fruit, which again, of course, is symptomatic of ripeness. A medium length and a ripe finish. So it sounds like Tufi, that's just, even though it's very ripe, it's just staying about on the ripe side of ripeness. On the finish, there is still some acidity. Tufi says rustic tannins. So again, we were talking about rustic last week as being a bit of a pejorative term, but meaning in the sense of not polished, of being a bit coarse, perhaps just a bit ungainly, powerful, but you know, without elegance, that kind of thing. Certainly that would be, I think, sounds right to me for the variety Mourvedre. Now, if any of you guys want to think back to Bandol, if you did taste Bandol last time, or if you just know Bandol style wine, now would be a good time to think about the differences between Bandol and what we're tasting just now. Sarah Jumilla, ripe red cherry, bit earthy, mouth coating, grainy tannins, mouth coating, yeah, so Tufi, Michelle, Sarah, everyone's saying a lot of tannins, mouth coating tannins, not a ton of fruit on the palate, same point that Michelle made, and acidity is moderate, 15% alcohol, but doesn't feel as high as that. Yeah, good notes. So a lot of concentration, a lot of density of fruit, but it can absorb the alcohol when you've got that much body. Okay, let's see whether I can add anything to the conversation. I think you guys have ticked off most of the points. Let's just see what Kirsten has. Kirsten, just 13.5% alcohol, okay. Red and black fruits, medium plus tannins, but they're ripe. A dry finish, good. Also a bit rustic, feels very ripe, yeah. So ripeness is everything here. And you can see my third bullet point here that, you know, avoiding over ripeness is such a key issue, I think, in this area. I think, you know, I haven't been there, I haven't spoken to winemakers from this region, but tasting the wines, I feel like, you know, this is a challenge that they have to work with. And, you know, blending with these other varieties can certainly help. Dense concentrated fruit. Although I do take your point that perhaps the focal point of the wine is not so much on the mid palate. Mourvèdre, because it's got such powerful tannins, which are felt on the gums, a bit like the Bordeaux varieties, can perhaps take away the attention from the tongue, from the fruit on the tongue. So maybe, yeah, you do feel as if the palate is a bit light for how powerful the tannins are. That could be. Sweet fruit on the finish. So, you know, in the context of the Priorat, I was saying I'm going to give Priorat the benefit of the doubt and say that it finishes dry. Here, I think, I mean, obviously it depends on the exact wine that you have, but in my experience here, we're going to go the other way and say that the finish of Jumilla and Yecla with the Mourvèdre, the very ripe Mourvèdre, just tips towards sweetness, really. There are a lot of dry elements in this wine. It is not syrupy sweet all the way through. I think the dry tannins, those powerful, slightly rustic tannins that you are mentioning, certainly help dry out the wine. But I do find the finish generally to be quite sweet on these wines. So just an interesting point of difference, just going a bit further south, well, actually quite a bit further south from Priorat. And then I think we might be tipping over into a pretty ripe finish here. If you think about my comparison with other very southern European regions on the same latitude, why don't Italian wines have this same issue about the sweetness on the finish? Because of the acidity, of course. You know, not that we don't have any acidity here, we do, but not compared, nothing like the high acidity of the Italian reds. Confusion in Southern Rhone. So go back to our Bandol discussion. Sarah saying, do you think there's a difference in tannin quality here versus in Bandol? Do you think it's better in Bandol? Well, one thing I think about the wine styles overall is that Bandol is more age-worthy. And I think I feel that, you know, primarily because the tannin is a bit firmer and a bit drier in Bandol, which gives me the impression that the tannins have got some way to go to soften and to contribute their savory quality to the wine. Whereas in Bandol, yes, they're rustic, but I feel they're quite fruity and ripe as well already. And I think, I don't know where they're going to go. I think that the structure may not hold up as long as Bandol would do. So if, as we are going to say, that being age-worthy is an indispensable characteristic of quality in a wine, I think on that basis, you know, we would say that the tannins in Bandol perhaps have got something more to offer in that sense than those of Jumilla or Yecla do. Now, I haven't tasted every Jumilla or Yecla. There may be, you know, expensive or just great producers that I don't know about. So I'm not saying that it's impossible. There could be equally age-worthy, high-quality, structured, dry styles from Jumilla and Yecla. But I would say that I think that would be out of the ordinary, whereas I think Bandol ordinarily is a 15, 20-year wine with a good structure. So I do think the tannins are powerful in Bandol, but they're just not, they don't seem to have the same absolute heaviness and density. I kind of feel like here they just weigh down the gums a little bit, whereas I feel perhaps they're just a bit more, perhaps a bit more integrated into the body of the wine, so perhaps less obtrusive in Bandol. Tufi making the comparison, my Bandol is funkier, so maybe more of those earthy, savory, meaty notes, but even more, even then more elegant and balanced and drier than the Yecla. Yeah, like I said, I think drier in Bandol, drier finish, with a way more savory finish. Yeah, the overall quality is higher. Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, I find it fascinating, being the geek I am, to compare two very different appellations, but with the same principle of variety. But I think in terms of abstract quality, Bandol is always going to win out. But then we're talking about a different price category and probably a different market function. So maybe it's not even fair to compare the two. Okay, so please shout if you have any last thoughts or observations on Monastrell or Jumilla. Otherwise, let me just make a couple of final remarks. Diversity. I mean, isn't diversity great that we just saw in this session? I mean, you know, we talked a little bit about diversity last week in French Reds, big country, you know, big range of climates, and just the same thing here, you know, from the moderate climate of northwest Spain for the Mencea, all the way to the super ripe, concentrated Jumilla in the southeast, with, you know, some stops in the middle. The stops in the middle, you know, the Tempranillo stops in Ribera del Duero, and we didn't do it today, but in Rioja, are maybe not by accident, so that those have been such a focal point for the Spanish wine industry, as being places where you can preserve both acidity, but also get fruit ripeness. It may not be a coincidence that those areas are historically important. But I do think that regions like Bierzo and the surrounding regions there in the northwest, in the cooler climates closer to the Atlantic, offer a lot of will offer a lot of important contributions to Spanish wine as we go forward in the next decades. Everywhere else is going to have the challenge that I talked about at the top about managing ripeness, really. There's a lot of ways you can do that, not just in the cellar. So yeah, in the cellar you can blend varieties with more acid, more tannin, more dryness. But in the vineyard, you know, the viticulture is so important. It's very facile to say, oh, well, you know, soon it's going to be too hot to grow Tempranillo here or Garnacha there. It really downplays the amount of tools that a winemaker has in their toolbox, especially in the vineyard, to manage the ripeness in terms of the way they manage each individual vine, and things like rootstocks and leafing and de-leafing and aspect and all sorts of interesting things like that. So I've got plenty of hope yet for these already warm climates. Ripe but dry is a good combination. I would love for you to take that one away and think about what that means, ripe but dry, in the context of the Iberian Peninsula. It's very easy around the world to make ripe wines. There's many warm climates all over Europe and outside of Europe making ripe wines, but the trick is to make them dry as well. Why do you want dry? Because it makes you want to have another glass. You know, they're not cloying or sweet or heavy. So ripe but dry in places like Priorat, Ribera, Bierzo, and possibly in better examples of Jumilla, it's a great recipe. It's a great recipe. Many consumers do like ripe, concentrated, powerful styles, but even better, we can keep them on the dry side, I think. Compared to France, then of course you've got a bit of additional ripeness here, a bit more fruity and generous. So, you know, we were complaining to some extent about some of the tannins in places like Cahors and Madaran. Here, because of the additional ripeness, yes, you might have the same level of tannins, but the tannin is riper and perhaps softer. So the additional ripeness is helping you out with the tannins. That's the flip side of the ripeness of fruit, which is more of a challenge. Ripeness of tannins is a good thing. So there's plenty to like about ripeness as well in that sense. And it also gives Spain the ability to compete with all those international style, big, powerful reds that I was just talking about. So good for marketing positioning. But I think that the future of Spain is about anything that can preserve freshness and balance. But the great thing about Spain is just the diversity. I said at the beginning, and I said at the end, just a wonderful diversity of styles, and there's so many more that we didn't even touch on today. Spain, excuse me, just like Italy, has got so many great indigenous varieties that we don't even see on the international markets, but I think we're going to spend a lot of time. People like Torres have spent a lot of time on them already, and we will be seeing more of those, hopefully in our local markets in the decades to come. But I think that will do it for today. So thank you once more for your kind attention and for your great comments as ever. I really felt like you were going to the heart of the wines. So thank you for those comments. And we will be up to our final week next week. Very sad, but we will have another great session, this time comparing more wines from Southern Europe, but from across the Mediterranean Sea in Italy. So I'm looking forward to that session. So same time next week. I will see you then for Italian Reds. Thank you, guys.